Welcome to my second annual virtual tour of some of my favorite folks who are interred at Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. Laurel Hill is a Victorian-era cemetery. It opened in 1836. It holds the remains of 75,000 people among its scenic 78 acres in the East Falls section of Philadelphia. It's on Ridge Pike, and a bus ride on SEPTA 161 or R gets you within a block of the gatehouse. It costs nothing to visit. It is open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. through November, and then 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. in the winter months. Laurel Hill is the place where you can jog, you can walk your dog, ride your bike, or just wander and admire the monuments, listen to the birds, marvel at the trees. We're also a certified arboretum, or just meditate. I'm Joe Lex. I'm a retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University here in Philadelphia, and a volunteer tour guide at both Laurel Hill and West Laurel Hill cemeteries. I also do their monthly podcast, All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories. Before we start today, I'm going to recommend that you download the app for Laurel Hill Cemetery. And this will give you information about the most popular sites there. It doesn't matter whether you're at the cemetery. That helps, of course, if you can actually see the monuments. But you can hear interesting biographies on a lot of different people just by using this app. Here are some of the people who are included in the app. I will not talk about any of these people today. I don't talk about many of them on the tours that I give either, because I think the app does such a good job of telling you about them. Here are some more. So we come to the 10 that I have chosen for my 2021 virtual tour. And as usual, it is not just individuals. Sometimes it is families. We will go through each of these, spend a few minutes on each of them. You can hop around if you want to, but it's probably best to follow it serially. Our first person is Ferdinand Hassler and his family. They are interred at Section P, Lots 2 and 3. That is Ferdinand and his wife and his son. His granddaughter and his great-granddaughter I am going to mention also, because they follow through with 4 generations of excellence, even though they are not buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery. This is where their tomb is located. It's right beside a set of steps that leads you down to Elijah Kent Kane, the Arctic explorer, and not too far from Charles Thomson, the recording secretary of the Continental Congress. This is Ferdinand Rudolph Hassler. He was born in Switzerland to a prosperous watchmaking family. He became an expert in mathematics, astronomy, and geodesy, which is the science of accurately measuring the Earth's geometric shape, orientation in space, and gravitational field. He became obsessed with precision and orderly procedure, and for a while he was actually Attorney General of Switzerland. He immigrated to the United States in 1805. He brought his furniture, his artwork, and a library of more than 3,000 books. He could write and converse in 5 different languages. He got his U.S. citizenship, and he became friends with this man, the Mint Director, Professor Robert Patterson, who's buried in Section H of Laurel Hill Cemetery. Patterson recommended him to Thomas Jefferson for a job as either a surveyor or astronomer, and he quickly made friends with Thomas Jefferson. The United States did most of its commerce by ships at this time, but hundreds and hundreds of ships kept running aground and sinking because of poor charts. In 1807, Jefferson convinced Congress to authorize $50,000 for a coastal survey. Now, in 1803, the allocation for Lewis and Clark had only been, believe it or not, $2,500. But the final outlay for them was closer to $50,000. so Jefferson knew this was not an immodest amount to ask for. But Congress delayed the funds, so Hassler took a job as mathematics instructor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Then he lost his job in 1810 when Congress ruled that the Army lacked authority to employ civilian teachers. In 1811, Albert Gallatin, who was also born in Switzerland, was serving as the Secretary of the Treasury, and he finally gave Hassler the go-ahead. Now, the first thing that Hassler did was go to London to have some proper instruments built. But the War of 1812 broke out, and he was stuck in England for 3 years. He came back with a theodolite, which is a movable telescope mounted so that it can rotate around both horizontal and vertical axes to provide angular readouts. There are several short teaching films that I found on YouTube that will show you how to use a theodolite. He finally started working in 1816, but Congress became impatient with his slow, meticulous measurements and work, and they fired him in 1818. They soon discovered they could find no one else to do the work that he was doing, and the shipwrecks continued along the U.S. coast. For the next 10 years, Hassler tried to support himself by writing textbooks, teaching, and selling volumes out of his precious library, one by one. Hassler was even offered a job by Russia, but he turned them down. He knew that America would come to its senses. In 1830, 12 years after he was fired, he received a commission to develop standard measurements for the country. International trade was in jeopardy because of different concepts of pounds and bushels and gallons. Entirely without authority, he set out to establish standards for all measurements, and he named himself as the superintendent of weights and measures. In 1836, Congress directed the Treasury Secretary to adapt what Hassler had already done and to use all the weights and measures he had already established as standards. So today, the reason that a gallon is 231 cubic inches is because Ferdinand Hassler said that it was 231 cubic inches. Finally, in 1832, 25 years after they first hired him, Congress realized that no one else could do the job they needed done on the coast, and they rehired him. So in 1836, he had another theodolite built to his specifications. It lasted until 1873, when it was destroyed by a tornado. For the rest of his life, Hassler set the standard for coastal measurements. His theodolite was a true masterwork of precision. He carried around in a special cart. The cart had a disappearing dining table and a wine chamber. In 1836, Hassler told President Jackson he needed $6,000 a year. Jackson exploded and said, "That's as much as I pay the Treasury Secretary." Hassler replied, "You can find a Treasury Secretary anywhere. There is only one Hassler." And he got his raise. Many of Hassler's charts are still in use. The Coast Survey eventually became the Coast and Geodetic Survey, and in 1970 it became part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. In 1843, during an unexpected sleet storm, Hassler tried to protect his precious instruments and fell in the dark. He injured himself on a protruding rock. He deteriorated and died a few days later at age 73, probably from internal bleeding, from what I can find about this. He was interred at Laurel Hill Cemetery next to a staircase near the river. Members of the Coast Survey erected a stone monument over his grave, complete with a theodolite. In 1993, friends and family replaced the 150-year-old stone, which had deteriorated greatly, and they replaced it with this new one. The old stone went to the National Institute of Standards and Technology for their museum, and in the same year, Hassler Park was created at NOAA headquarters in Silver Springs, Maryland, with a plaque that was dedicated to him. And when NOAA launched its new boat a few years ago, they had no problems coming up with a name. It is the Ferdinand R. Hassler. A brief mention of Hassler's son, Charles Augustus, graduated from Rutgers and then obtained a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He went into the Navy in 1834, was promoted to surgeon 10 years later. He served in the Mexican War, but in November 1846, he drowned off Fisher's Island, Long Island Sound, in the wreck of the side-wheeler steamboat SS Atlantic. He is buried next to his father. Dr. Charles' daughter, Mary Caroline Hassler, married Simon Nukem, U.S. Naval Admiral known for his work in mathematics and astronomy. They are buried together at Arlington National Cemetery. Mary and Simon's daughter, this is Ferdinand's great-granddaughter, Anna Nukem Mcgee, became a surgeon. She was the only female doctor in uniform during the Spanish-American War. And after the war, she helped establish both the United States Army Nurse Corps in 1900 and the United States Navy Nurse Corps in 1902. She is also interred at Arlington. Next, we are moving to the middle of the central section of Laurel Hill for some Vanuxams and Potters. This is where their plot is located, if you're familiar with the cemetery. We're going to start with Frederick William Vanuxam. He was born in Cuba in 1829. His father, Louis, was lost at sea in 1831 when he was a toddler, and his mother died before he reached his teens. He was raised by an uncle in Bristol, Pennsylvania. When he was 17, he heard of an opportunity to join a general store in Knoxville, Tennessee, so he moved there. When he came of age, he went into business for himself with his own general store, where it is said that he primarily sold books. He also worked as a cashier at a bank. He married a young lady named Elizabeth Kennedy, who was the daughter of a wealthy Knoxville, Tennessee merchant. When the Civil War broke out, he claimed that he was forcefully conscripted into the Confederate Army, and his property was confiscated. But because of his experience in running a general store, he succeeded in landing a position in the quartermaster department, quote, so that he should not be compelled to do any actual act of hostility against his government, for he was a strong Union man and loved his country too well to fight against it. Well, after Burnside's capture of Knoxville in late 1863, Vanuxam escaped to the Union lines, and he came back to Philadelphia in the spring of 1864. He had lost everything. He soon got a position with the Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York as a local agent, and he became very successful. The firm of Vanuxam, Bates, and Lambert eventually held about 1/6 of the insurance policies in Philadelphia. In January 1880, he collapsed at home and he died shortly thereafter. His death certificate gave Bright's disease, in other words, glomerulonephritis, as his cause of death. And he was laid to rest at Laurel Hill Cemetery. He was only 50 years old. So here is his tombstone, but where is his Confederate Army marker? We are not afraid to show Confederate Army markers at Laurel Hill Cemetery. We actually have General John Pemberton, a Confederate general, and there very boldly is the Confederate flag in front of his grave marker. Our Confederate soldier specialist, Sam Ricks, checked for me, and it turns out that Vanuxam's obituary story about being forcefully conscripted into the CSA was, let us say, incorrect. In other words, BS circumstances. Here is Lewis Clark Vanuxam. He was born in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1859, the third of 9 children to Frederick and Elizabeth. Many sources incorrectly refer to him as Lewis, Lewis, but as you can see from his tombstone, it is Louis. Lewis entered Princeton in the class of 1879. That was quite a class, that class of 1879. Among his classmates were Cyrus Hall McCormick, Jr., Mahlon Pitney, Associate Supreme Court Justice from 1911 to 1922, and Thomas Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States. Lewis remained friends with his classmates for life. He rarely missed a reunion. In 1878, Lewis's older sister Jenny married businessman William H. Potter, who became a fast friend and business partner. In fact, in December 1894, Lewis and his brother-in-law Potter made news when they purchased most of the Abraham Lincoln memorabilia that had been displayed at the World's Fair Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Included in their purchase were furniture and books owned by Lincoln, plus his marriage certificate, which they bought for $40. Abraham Lincoln's marriage certificate. At the time, this was considered the most valuable collection of Lincoln relics in existence. In 1895, Lewis was elected to the Board of Trustees of Jefferson Medical College. His brother-in-law, Potter, was president of Jefferson Medical College at the time. Another board member was Simon Gratz, Laurel Hill Cemetery, Chapel Section, Lot 3. Lewis took a particular interest in physiology, and at his own expense, he developed a physiology laboratory which became world-renowned. He was also a trustee and a director of the Pennsylvania Institute for the Deaf and Dumb, now the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf. Brother-in-law Potter was manager of this institute. Now, Lewis took ill in December of 1903, and he died on December 21st of pneumonia. He was only 43 years old. He had never married. He died without known issue. The Philadelphia Inquirer published only a one-paragraph statement of death, and you'll notice it spelled his name incorrectly. He was buried in the family plot with a modest marker on the 23rd of December, 1903. But he left a gift of $25,000. This New York Times article is incorrect. It was to establish the Lewis Clark Vanuxem Foundation for Public Lectures. This time, the middle name is misspelled. They stuck an E in there. The money is to be used for a series of from 4 to 6 annual free lectures. The most recent 2020 Vanuxem lecture was to be Artificial Intelligence and Democracy. It was supposed to be on March 25th, 2020, by physicist and cosmologist Max Tegmark, but it was postponed due to the COVID-19 outbreak. Vanuxem speakers have included Robert Oppenheimer, Edwin Hubble, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Marcia Angel, Craig Venter, Joan Didion, Elie Wiesel, Seymour Hersh, many, many others. The lectures are free and they are open to the public. And fortunately, they spell both his first and his middle name correctly. Well, I will briefly mention William Potter's family, but they really deserve more time than I can give them here. They are buried literally around the corner from the Vanuxem family. The Potters made their money from their father Thomas's business, the largest manufacturers of oilcloth in the United States. In 1878, William Potter married Jane Kennedy Vanuxem. Their daughter, Adeline Coleman Potter, married Joseph Walker Ware, whose sister Lucretia married George Herbert Walker. Lucretia and George had a daughter, Dorothy Ware Walker, who married Senator Prescott Sheldon Bush. And Dorothy and Prescott's son, George Herbert Walker Bush, was 41st President of the United States. So William was President Bush's great-great-granduncle once removed. The Potters are in lot J106. That's just around the corner from the Vanuxem plot. This includes William's older brother, Thomas Potter Jr., 1850 to 1910. He was a successful businessman who took over the family business. He served in the Pennsylvania National Guard from 1887 until his death. He was a colonel when he died. Thus, he was indeed Colonel Potter. Thomas's wife, Lily Alexiana Wilson Potter, 1855 to 1954, and his daughter, Olive Potter Earnshaw Crolius, 1885 to 1958, both survived the sinking of the RMS Titanic in April 1912. Thus, there should be a different podcast to talk about them. In 1895, William was named trustee of the Jefferson Medical College and Hospital, and the next year he was elected president of the board, a position he retained for the rest of his life. William turned down the opportunity to be ambassador to Berlin in 1897 and to St. Petersburg a few years later. In January 1897, William's wife and Lewis's sister, Jenny, died. She was 41 years old. All of their children were 18 years and under. So in May 1899, William married Hetty Vanuxem, Jenny and Lewis's younger sister. She died barely 2 years later. He never remarried. William served simultaneously as president of the Jefferson Medical College, a member of the Board of City Trustees, a manager of the Pennsylvania Institution for the Deaf and Dumb, etc., etc., etc. Very civically engaged. He died in 1926. Next, we come to Joseph Parker Norris Sr. and Jr. They're located sort of smack dab in the middle of Section K. They have an extremely simple stone. Joseph Parker Norris, he was the son of Isaac Norris, 1802 to 1865, and Mary Pepper. So his uncle was Dr. William Pepper. There are way too many connections to follow on her side. The Pepper family deserves its own podcast sometime. Norris was an 1867 graduate of Penn and a very prosperous attorney. He and his wife Isabel had 9 children. Joseph had 2 hobbies. He started collecting bird eggs in his teens. By the time he reached his 20s, he was acknowledged to have one of the finest collections of bird eggs in the country. His other hobby was Shakespeare. He edited a column called Shakespearean Gossip in the American Bibliopolist from February 1875 to April 1877. In 1873, he had established a letter-writing relationship with Joseph Crosby of Zanesville, Ohio, one of the 3 great American Shakespearean scholars of the 19th century. Norris and Crosby owned 2 of the 3 best Shakespearean libraries in private hands in the United States in the late 1800s. The 3rd collection of Shakespeare, and the best, owned to another Philadelphian, Horace Howard Furness, who is buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery, Section T, Lot 7. Norris and he were close friends. I talked about him in the earlier virtual tour that I did on YouTube, the Hotspots and Storied Plots #1. The letters that Norris sent to Crosby have been lost, but the letters from Crosby to Norris were discovered in the Folgell Library in 1975. They were published as One Touch of Shakespeare, Letters of Joseph Crosby to Joseph Parker Norris, 1875 to 1878. Shakespeare scholars consider these invaluable. And Norris wrote quirky monographs like Portraits of Shakespeare and The Death Mask of Shakespeare, both from 1884, and he often took up lost causes. For instance, he pushed for the opening of Shakespeare's grave to authenticate his death mask. He even wanted to do phrenology studies on the skull. The London Evening Telegraph called him a bone grubber. When Norris died in 1916, the New York Times mistakenly published his obituary under his son's name. Now, the son, Joseph Parker Norris Jr., was apparently reluctant to have his photo taken. I searched everywhere I could think of, even among passports, and I could come up with nothing. He too was a lawyer and an egg collector. But in 1904, he and 9 of his society friends decided to have a bal masque for society bachelors and their dates. By the next year, 1905, this had become the smartest gathering of the year and an annual tradition on Shrove Tuesday before Ash Wednesday, which was officially the end of the social season in Philadelphia. Now, even after Joseph married Miss Mary Rawlings Brady in 1909, the ball continued. It got bigger and better every year. Quoting from one society column, Chinamen danced merrily with Cleopatras, geisha girls cavorted with solemn-faced judges, and coquettish glances from gypsy maidens softened the stern demeanors of magistrates and Standard Oil magnates. The unmasking occurred with a trumpet knell at 1 a.m. In 1924, several years after Prohibition became law of the land, newly elected Philadelphia Mayor W. Freeland Kendrick asked President Calvin Coolidge to loan the city a military general to help him rid the municipal government of crime and corruption. Coolidge sent him the Marines' Marine, General Smedley Butler, 2-time recipient of the Medal of Honor for bravery, and later in life author of the 1935 classic War is a Racket. Smedley was born in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Within 48 hours of taking over, Butler had organized raids on more than 900 speakeasies in the city, ordering them padlocked or destroyed. In addition, he attempted to eliminate other illegal activities, bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, and police corruption. And it wasn't just the lower classes he was after. He ordered crackdowns on the social elite's favorite hangouts like the Ritz-Carlton and the Union League. Butler swore he would keep the ball mask dry. J. Parker Norris Jr. was warned. He sent notices to the attendees that liquor was off limits and people with hip flasks would be arrested. That night, the newspapers had a field day. Quote, society girls in ballet costumes and some in even flimsier attire drew hundreds of spectators to Broad and Walnut Streets when the famed bal masque was turned into a sort of hide-and-seek with the Ritz-Carlton and the Bellevue Stratford as bases. When the dancing started, 4 detectives in plain clothing insisted on getting into the ballroom, although just before it had been understood that they were only to work from the corridors. The detectives were the only persons on the dance floor not in costume. Norris was furious. These men are here in spite of a formal written protest lodged at City Hall today on behalf of the committee in charge of this private dance. The chairman was asked whether they had picked men with social graces who might be expected to make themselves as inconspicuous as possible under the circumstances. No, said Mr. Norris, they're just plain harness bulls. Are they dancing? I doubt it, he answered, looking toward the ballroom. I haven't heard any crashes. The shifting back and forth between the 2 hotels became so frequent by 11 o'clock that hundreds of spectators filled Broad Street. At first, the girls and their escorts stopped for cloaks and overcoats before making the passage abroad, and then when it became part of the game, they just ran out in costume. Some of the costumes were extraordinarily flimsy for streetwear, and the crowd gasped, but the girls turned pirouettes in the street and merely laughed. J. Parker Norris Jr. died on January 18, 1931, after a long illness. The 1931 bal masque had been canceled only a few weeks before because of his serious condition. He was buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery in the family plot on January 20th. The bal masque resumed in 1932. Joseph Jr. does not even have an inscription on the family marker. Next we have John Baird. John Baird was born in Derry, Ireland in 1820 and came to the United States the next year with his father, who was a coppersmith. They are buried in Section K, Lot 228. In 1841, John Baird established a marble works at the northwest corner of Ridge Road and Spring Garden with his older brother Matthew. It quickly became the largest marble works in the city because of his use of steam tools to both cut and polish. He started supplying his product to Laurel Hill and other cemeteries around the country. In 1852, Philadelphia architect Thomas Eustace Walter, who's buried in Section G, Lot 232, hired John Rice, John and Matthew Baird, and Charles Hebner to supply the marble portico columns for the United States Capitol building. The marble was quarried in Lee, Massachusetts. Baird was paid handsomely. His older brother Matthew left the business in 1854, and he joined the Baldwin Locomotive Company, and he eventually became president of Baldwin. Matthew is buried in a different lot in Section K. In 1856, John Baird modeled and constructed the Yellow Fever Monument for Laurel Hill Cemetery, Section W, Lot 200. It is for 13 men and 2 women volunteers who died treating yellow fever victims in Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia in 1855. I could spend an entire hour just talking about this monument, its symbolism, and its various quotations, in addition to discussing some of the very interesting people who were interred there. You'll have to come on tours at Laurel Hill Cemetery to hear more about that, though. In 1863, he constructed this Venetian Gothic mausoleum for Henry P. Voorhees. You can see it in Section S, Lot 71. Needless to say, Baird's business boomed during the Civil War, and many Philadelphia families wanted to commemorate their family members who had been killed in battle. In 1870, Baird designed and constructed what we thought was the first mausoleum in Millionaires Row at Laurel Hill Cemetery. It turns out this is not true. Apparently there was one before this. It was for Gustavus A. Benson, Section K, Lot 324. It is also Venetian Gothic, as you see. In 1871, Baird sold his marble works to Van Gundy and Young, and then he got deeply involved in the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876. In 1878, he was elected president of City National Bank. He was heavily involved in education, including the Philadelphia School of Design for Women, which is now part of Moore College of Art and Design, the Spring Garden Institute, and Williamson Free School of Mechanical Trades. In 1889, he commissioned, built, and donated a scale model of the Centennial Exposition grounds to the city of Philadelphia. It contained 200 buildings along with thousands of human figures, trees, etc. It was 30 feet by 30 feet. It was too big to fit into Memorial Hall, so it went into storage in the basement and was virtually unseen for more than a century. On 13 February 1894, John Baird died at the age of 73 at his home at Broad and Columbia. He was buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery, Section K, Lot 228, 3 days later. Note that the great marble master has a simple stone made of granite. And in 2007, Baird's magnificent model of the Centennial Exposition grounds found its permanent home in the basement of Memorial Hall in the Please Touch Museum. Joseph Clay Neal was one of the great authors of his time. If he's remembered today, it is as the American Dickens. Go to Ferdinand Hassler's tomb, then carefully go down the stone stairway one flight, since there is no handle, and stop on the first level. This is the only known painting of him. It's done from a lithograph rather than from life. His marker is still impressive, but it's easily bypassed and is in disrepair. Now, the first American humor periodical was called The Bee. It only lasted for 3 weeks in 1765. This was followed by Political Censor, Porcupine's Gazette, The Wasp, The Corrector, and The Portfolio, and then The Tickler by Toby Scratcham. Joseph Clay Neal was born in Greenland, New Hampshire. His father, the Reverend James A. Neal, died before Joseph was 2 years old, and his mother moved to Philadelphia, where she operated a bookstore and worked in a library. So Neal grew up in a very bookish household. He started writing at an early age. In 1831, he took a job as editor of the Pennsylvanian, a Democratic daily newspaper, until 1844. He wrote a series called City Worthies that were broadly drawn caricatures of various down and out inhabitants of the city. They were gathered together into a collection called Charcoal Sketches. It was published in Philadelphia in 1837. Charles Dickens actually republished them in London. An early review of Charcoal Sketches says, "No one who has his faculties in a healthy condition can read them and not feel convinced they are the productions of a superior and highly gifted mind." They not only smack strongly of what all true men love, genuine humor, rich, racy, glorious humor, at which you may indulge yourself in an honest outbreak of laughter and not feel ashamed afterward because you have thrown away good mirth at a pitiful jest. In all of them, light and trifling as they seem, and pleasant as they unquestionably are, there is a deep and solemn moral. Now, as an editor, everything he prints bears the stamp of good sense. His productions all bear the stamp of vigorous originality. He imitates no one, and least of all Mr. Dickens, to whom he has sometimes been compared. Now, along with these two other Laurel Hill noteworthies, Louis Antoine Godey and Morton McMichael, he became owner and editor of the Philadelphia Saturday Review, which I will cover at length in an upcoming podcast. I believe it's either the September or October podcast for 2021 that I will talk about the Philadelphia Saturday Review. They published several short stories by an up-and-coming Philadelphia author, Edgar Allan Poe. Another of his publications was Neal's Saturday Gazette and Ladies' Literary Museum. He took special interest in a young schoolgirl writer named Alice Bradley Haven, who had submitted and published several sketches to the Philadelphia Gazette under the name Alice G. Lee, generally known as Cousin Alice. Neal and Alice married shortly after meeting. Joseph Clay Neal, who suffered for years with tuberculosis, died rather suddenly of congestion of the brain at age 40, leaving behind his widow Alice, 21 years his junior. They had been married for 7 months. Alice Bradley Haven assumed editorial control of the Gazette for 5 years and wrote several popular children's books under her pen name, Cousin Alice. She remarried. She had 5 children. She died at age 34, shortly after the birth of her 5th child. She's buried in Westchester County in New York. Now we're going to head way over to the south section of the cemetery. The Waln family plot is located right at the rim of Laurel Hill Cemetery, and you cannot avoid the traffic of Ridge Avenue whizzing by. Samuel Morris Waln was born in Haverford to a wealthy family, and like his distant cousin Owen Wister and other Eastern dudes, he was attracted to adventures in the Wild West, hunting, camping, prospecting. He even had his own clothing made for his adventures. He and his New York friend Harry Strong headed to Wichita Falls, Texas in early spring of 1888. They planned to be out of touch with civilization for a month or two. They outfitted themselves with a wagon, a team of mules, and 2 saddle ponies. Then they went north, arriving in Denver in early June, and they stayed there for about a week. There they hired a man named Thomas O'Brien as cook, guide, and teamster, and started for Boston, Montana. Now, Montana was still a year away from statehood. What O'Brien thought of these city slickers at first is unknown, but he had to notice Waln's stirrups and guns were very expensive, and they were even emblazoned with his nickname, the Red Dog. He figured there had to be some money involved. On July 27th, they reached Canyon Creek, Wyoming, where they stopped and briefly visited with legendary frontiersman Boney Ernest, who is now a Wyoming icon. Amongst many other things, Boney, which was short for Bonaparte, is credited with teaching Buffalo Bill Cody how to be a military scout. Waln and Strong told Ernest they were on their way to Bozeman. They intended to buy a bunch of horses and ship them back east and sell them at a big profit. Well, in the second week of August, a ranch hand found the jawbone of a human being with teeth filled with gold, strongly suggesting that it belonged to Waln. And you notice that he doesn't smile in either of his photos, probably to hide bad dentition. Shortly thereafter, they found a decomposing body with a silk handkerchief around its neck and a silver bangle dangling from her wrist. A week later, they discovered another decomposing body. The two victims were Waln and Strong. Both were dressed only in their underwear, indicated they had probably been killed in their sleep. Waln had apparently had his skull split open with an axe, and scavenging animals such as coyotes had carried his jaw away from his body. The top of Strong's head was missing, as he had been shot point blank with a shotgun. Local law enforcement figured out who the victims were. They sent word back east, and Waln's brother quickly showed up and had the two bodies sent back east. The next year, Waln's family had a monument made out of Pennsylvania granite. They sent it to Wyoming, where it was placed on 23 December 1889. O'Brien was trailed to Aspen, Colorado, where he had disposed of the murdered men's possessions. He was then captured after stealing some horses. He was tried and sentenced to 14 years in prison for horse theft. Even though witnesses identified him as the man who had been with Waln and Strong, he was never tried for their murder. Now, contrary to legend, O'Brien did not die in prison. Samuel Morris Waln's grave lay undisturbed at Laurel Hill Cemetery for many years, until a few decades after his death, a package arrived from Wyoming. It was his jawbone. Without fanfare, his jaw was interred with the rest of the body. Buried on Millionaire's Row is the Snowden family. I want to mention a few of them. This is where their plot is located. As you can see, it's very close to the bridge over Hunting Park into Central, or from Central into South, and vice versa. The patriarch for this branch of the family is Archibald Loudon Snowden. He was born in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania on 11 August 1835. His uncle, James Ross Snowden, was both a treasurer and director of the United States Mint. He is buried in Section G. And yes, I will do a podcast in the future on all the directors of the Mint who are buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery. Archibald assisted in raising a regiment of Pennsylvania volunteer infantry for the Civil War and was commissioned a lieutenant colonel. He was subsequently elected captain of the 1st City Troop of Philadelphia. Snowden became chief coiner at the Philadelphia Mint in 1866 and was superintendent and chief executor from 1879 to 1885. He twice declined the offer to serve as director of the United States Mint. He did, however, serve as postmaster of Philadelphia from 1877 to 1879. Snowden served as United States Minister to Greece, Romania, and Serbia from 1889 to 1892. And then from 1892 to 1893, he served as United States Minister to Spain. For many years, he was also the superintendent of the Fairmount Park Commission. He struggled unsuccessfully to keep horseless carriages out of the park late in the 1890s. This article from 1899 describes his plight. He reached a compromise of the banning of motorized vehicles on what we now call Forbidden Drive. But the rest of Fairmount Park, as you know, you can drive through now. When Archibald Snowden died in 1912, he was laid to rest near the bridge on Laurel Hill's Millionaires Row. Archibald's brother, Nathaniel Randolph Snowden, decided to take another course. He moved to California. He became an actor and an auctioneer. He was known as Old Ralph the Shakespearean scholar and Old Ralph the fisherman. He drowned in the Salinas River in 1900. At age 70, he is buried in California. Archibald's son, Charles, was a stockbroker and a sportsman. In 1913, just 5 months after his father died, Charlie Snowden and his good friend John Converse were driving home from a morning fox hunt at Rose Tree. They were on the Westchester Pike when suddenly a buggy came out of a lane, cutting them off. Charles swerved, struck the rails of a trolley track, ran off the embankment, and turned over in a field. He was taken to Bryn Mawr Hospital, where his injuries were initially thought survivable, but he died the next day of a ruptured kidney. He left his wife, Bertha de Portales Churchman, and 2 children, Kay and Randy. 4 years later, in 1917, Bertha married the other man in the car, John Converse. They are buried together at West Laurel Hill Cemetery. Now, Archibald's daughter, Carolyn Smith Snowden, married Stuyvesant Wainwright, descendant of Peter Stuyvesant, in 1889. Their oldest son was partly named for his grandfather, Archibald, as Loudon S. Wainwright. That's Loudon Snowden Wainwright. Loudon's son, Loudon Wainwright Jr., was a famed journalist and critic for Life magazine for many years. And then, of course, with the next generation, we have singer-songwriter Loudon Snowden Wainwright III. The next generation, these are his great-great-great-grandchildren, include singers Rufus Wainwright, Martha Wainwright, and Lucy Wainwright Roach. Logan Howard-Smith is interred just across the road from the Elverson Mausoleum. I discussed the Elversons at length in the first Hotspots video tour, if you want to go look at that. Logan was born in Montclair, New Jersey. He graduated from Germantown Academy in 1901 and the University of Pennsylvania in 1905. He had a keen interest in history. He was a member of several patriotic and genealogical societies, and of course the Union League. He was also a captain in the Pennsylvania National Guard and an excellent marksman. However, he did not serve in the Great War due to health concerns. Under the name Logan Marshall, he wrote or edited 17 books, including several bestsellers. The Sinking of the Titanic and Other Great Sea Disasters was one of his best known. And that was typical of Marshall. They were frequently published, his books were frequently published immediately after an event. Everybody remembers the Titanic, but then there was the ocean liner Empress of Ireland, which sank near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River in Canada following a collision in a thick fog with the Norwegian collier Storstad in the early morning of 29 May 1914. Of the 1,477 people on board, 1,012 died. This was the worst peacetime marine disaster in Canadian history. In 1937, Logan Howard-Smith died of chronic nephritis at age 53 years. He has a very simple stone. It's across the street from the Elverson family mausoleum, as I say. Many of his books are still available on Amazon, and we have at least one in the cemetery library. Now we're going to go to the north section, roughly midway between editress Sarah Josepha Hale and her boss, Louis Antoine Godey. Maude Kelly was born in England. She came to the United States with her father, Patrick Kelly, around 1903 when she was in her 20s. She studied medicine at the Women's Medical College and Philadelphia General Hospital. She became very politically active in public health issues and was involved in street demonstrations 2 years before the flu pandemic of 1918-1919. When the United States entered the Great War, Dr. Kelly and her fellow surgeon and business partner Alice Weld Tallant went to a local Army recruiting station to volunteer, but they were turned away. Dr. Tallant had studied at Smith College, and several graduates of that women's college were putting together an effort to bring assistance to the devastated towns of France. Although Dr. Kelly was not a Smith graduate, she was welcomed with open arms. What came to be known as the Smith College Relief Unit was assembled. The 19 women had useful skills of everything from shoe repair and operating a wireless to surgery. They all had to be 25 years old, physically fit, able to speak French, and able to drive cars. They reported their work back from the front, and many U.S. newspapers followed their time in France. Doctors Tallant and Kelly were eventually elevated to the rank of major in the French Medical Corps, and they were awarded the French Croix de Guerre. You'll see their names down at the bottom here. Dr. Alice Tallant and Dr. Maude Kelly, with the palm for their service. When Maude died in 1928, her obituary noted that her personal articles and medical equipment go to her, quote, friend and constant companion with whom she lived and had offices, Dr. Alice Weld Tallant. Maude Kelly, M.D., was buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery in her French Army uniform. Alice Tallant, M.D., outlived her by 30 years and died in Philadelphia in 1958, but she is buried in Nantucket, Massachusetts. Everybody knows about his statue on Millionaire's Row. Nobody talks about his fascinating family. I am talking about the Hayman. Right there, beautiful view, right next to General Patterson, near the empty Craig lot, across from K Point and Henry Biddle, Major Henry Biddle. This is from an advertisement in the late 1840s. William F. Hughes, Southwark Hay Press, Forks of 2nd Street below Christian, Philadelphia, the largest establishment in the United States. Constantly on hand, the best assortment of pressed and loose hay and straw, wholesale and retail. This would kind of be the equivalent today of owning every gas station in Philadelphia. Now, there is surprisingly little about him in the newspaper of the day. Obviously, he was a very rich man and very influential. He was president of the Bank of Philadelphia when he died. He had been elected to this position just a few years before. He had also ordered this grand bronze statue by Joseph Bailey, which is now on his gravesite. He ordered that sometime before he died. The cause of death is listed as acute gastroenteritis. Wow. His first wife, whom he had married in 1834, was Hannah Patton Lauer. She died in 1866 and is buried in the family plot. Son Edward D. Hughes took over the hay business, but he committed suicide by cutting his own throat in June 1873, just 2 months after his young wife died unexpectedly. The younger Hugheses are buried in section K, lot 89. It's right next to Fittler Circle. They do have an obelisk marker. In the same lot, though, are buried many people with the surname Jones, including in an unmarked grave, unfortunately, a woman named Indiana Jones, who died at age 76 in 1920. Now, Hughes' second wife, Margaret Harvey Hughes, 1826 to 1915, was a 30-year-old widow who supported herself and her 5 children by tutoring. She had been married to Isaac W. Moore, who died at 40 in 1856. He's interred in Section R. One of their children moved to California and became fire chief of Los Angeles. Margaret married William around 1861, and after he died, she moved to Los Angeles, and she became politically involved. She was the first woman member of the Los Angeles City Board of Education, elected in 1891, but she did not take her seat until a year later because of a legal battle to allow her to serve on that board. She actually has a Wikipedia entry, Margaret Harvey Hughes. Bradbury Bedell is buried in the Hughes plot, and I cannot find the connection with Hughes. He was an 1876 graduate of Yale, successful lawyer who retired to a life of leisure and art collection at age 33. I can also find no photo of him online. However, in 1889, the architect Wilson Eyre built him this elegant 3,100 square foot Queen Anne Revival house at the southeast corner of 22nd and Chestnut. That is right across the street from William Henry Furness's Unitarian Church. In 1893, Bedell was the only homeowner on the block to refuse an offer from developer John M. Sharp to buy his home. Sharp combined the mansions he had acquired into the Rittenhouse Hotel. In 1896, Bedell sued. While he and his wife were traveling in Europe, Sharp had plastered in huge letters the Rittenhouse on the side of the wall directly above his house, which is in the black circle here. People started mistaking his house as part of the hotel, and they were constantly disturbing him and his wife by trying to check into the hotel by pounding on his front door. This house stayed in 1950. It remained as this huge office building and car park was going up next door. By 1996, it was still there. Now it was a pharmacy on the ground floor. And if you go to the corner of 22nd and Chestnut today, you will see that it is still there, almost completely intact, the entire building. You will see that the ground floor, there is a laundry. Down here is one of my favorite Thai restaurants in the city. It's called Smile. So this mansion, this small mansion, has survived a lot over its 150 years in existence, and yet you can still admire it today. Now, somebody else buried in this plot is Emmeline Shin Reed Bedell. This is Bradbury's wife. She was active in the arts and better known for her humane work in more than 40 years in Philadelphia. She was president of the Auxiliary of the Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, SPCA. First person to sponsor the plan for horse watering stations. She was also connected to the Francisville Home for Smaller Animals, the Humane Education Society of Pennsylvania, and the Morris Refuge for Smaller Animals. And as I said before, astonishingly, neither Bradbury or Emmeline have a grave marker at the Hughes plot in Philadelphia. Here is a posthumous unveiling of the Emmeline Bedell horse drinking fountain in Center City. Now I'm going to stop there. We're coming up to about an hour. The virtual tour that I gave, as I said, I gave one last year. You can find that. It's called Hotspots and Storied Plots #1. Check out the podcast I do for Laurel Hill Cemetery. It's called All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories. You won't hear a lot of duplication of what I talked about in this particular tour, this virtual tour. I've already got my 2022 virtual tour planned. I'm starting to branch out more. I'm going to West Laurel Hill Cemetery also, and I'm going to talk about a few people who are at West Laurel Hill next time. But for next year, this is what I planned. I mean, I might change it. Thaddeus Morris, who was the father of fly fishing, Bascom Johnson, who was in the 1900 Olympics and then became a champion in the sex worker movement, preventing sex workers from being imported from other countries and helping them get back on their feet. George Glidden, who was a famed Egyptian scholar, Juan Portuondo, who made the best cigars in the country, David Hayes Agnew, a surgeon, subject of the Eakins Agnew Clinic portrait, Alan Calvert, the father of progressive resistance weightlifting, Boys Penrose, bigger than life. I can't even begin to tell you about Boys Penrose. I'll talk about May Bibbinghouse, a teenager who died of a heroin overdose in a Chinatown gambling parlor in the 1890s. Frederick Gudekunst, the great photographer of Philadelphia, and then Anna Meister, also known as Miramita, who had a very weird religious cult. She's over at West Laurel Hill Cemetery. Don't forget, visit if you are local. If you want to get in touch with me, joe@joelex.net is my email. If you want to check out some of the podcasts that I do or the radio show that I do weekly for WPPMLP here in Philadelphia, www.joelex.xyz, and that is my Twitter handle at joelex5. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay well, and I hope to be back next year with another Hotspots and Storied Plots.